Good morning. I am making this video as really a second attempt to put this new form of communication beyond what I have used in the past so far, which has been my blog, Thingumbob Esquire, where you can I can put a link to it from this video. My thoughts ranging back, for the past nearly 20 years on that blog alone. I was, last weekend, I put a video on that I thought I had saved, and it's hasn't. But I'll kind of take off from that spot. In fact, this morning we learned of the drone crisis over the Kremlin in Russia. And I was just viewing the CNN pundits from various intelligence connected agencies here and abroad, partnering with the so-called rules-based order combine. And the reason I start there is that what I was thinking about last weekend was that whether or not the population of this planet is consciously aware of the current danger facing the world in terms of the precipice that we're on right now of nuclear war, it will affect them in some way or another. Now, of course, there may be pockets on this planet in certain parts which simply don't have access to that reality, that information about that reality. You have to leave those aside. But that's very few these days of such pockets that have not even had it within their purview, their mental purview, that this might be happening right now. That we are in the midst of a crisis the like of which has it's not completely unprecedented, because I'm old enough to having lived through as a youngster the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it is a singular point in history. So how do people react to this? There's different ways in which they can react to it. They can react to it, for example, in the most simple way of just shunting aside any concerns about this and saying, I'm going to get on with my life. I'm going to do what I need to do. It's not going to bother me, and so forth. Now, if you have that sort of a mentality, a good question would be whether or not it still may affect you in the background, so to speak, of your psyche and some other ways. In other words, some psychological theory tends to look at human beings as isolated from the historical context of what they are reacting to or not reacting to, but isolating. And I believe that's a major problem. We can't isolate really anything above that historical context. Most importantly, including, as I've pointed out, the title of my blog, Thingumbob, is just kind of a play on Edgar Allan Poe's story, Thingumbob Esquire. That you can't look at him, Poe, out of context from his own historical epoch, because most of what he was writing about was a reaction and a satire or ironic metaphor. Ironic metaphor in the sense of what poetry is to his era. So you can't leave it out of context. For anybody in the current era to do that is simply a symptom of the kind of thinking that misses the forest for the trees. It's a fallacy of composition, one of the logical terms for the problems with argumentation, if you will. So to get back to the idea, the one perspective might be to say, I'm going to shunt this aside and get on with my life. Another one might be to try to deal with this from the perspective of some agenda that attempts to encompass the current history. And those agendas usually are given to us in one form or another by an establishment, by especially an ideology, a worldview, a Weltanschauung. I could see that today, for example, very clearly. I mean, in terms of war era, which we're currently obviously in, we're watching societies go to war, and we're in the midst of it. What I mean is the United States, with I don't know how many bases all around the world with military bases in the hundreds. I don't have the exact figure before me, but I know it's huge. So we have a militarized globe, which our worldview is, in most cases, is given to us, and we follow through on the axioms of that worldview as given to us. So you see, for example, I was just watching CNN, and what you see on there is that these mostly intelligence operatives are saying, well, Russia probably did this on their own so they could provoke something. Interesting. If that was the case, then their assumptions that they want us to pick up on and believe that Russia is losing in Ukraine, that therefore they're desperate to not lose, and they want an excuse. Well, what would the excuse be? To use super weapons, wouldn't it? Nuclear weapons. So it kind of defeats their own argument in a certain sense, if you think of it. Because if there needs to be an excuse to start World War III on the part of Russia, then why would we, the West, the so-called West, because I don't like that term at all, because really it's not really enlightening in any way. The West. We talk about these worldviews, for example, that I was just mentioning earlier. Is there a Western worldview? What does that mean? Unexamined one, an unexamined worldview, in which we are actors upon a stage, as Shakespeare would say, merely acting out a scenario given to us by our, you could say they're betters in a certain sense. They know more than us. They're the experts. Experts. So that's another option. In terms of the way in which you react, I listen to these experts, these talking heads, whatever they are, or I don't even have to listen to it. And one of the things I was recently writing about, for example, is that if you look at popular entertainment given to us today by the mass media, if you, quote, get into popular entertainment, in other words, you kind of are a participant in it because you're watching. You're accepting from the onset certain assumptions, as though you're on a team. And so much these days of what we are, what hits us, confronts us in the media, is that sort of thing, a team sport, almost a high-tech version of the Roman circuses in many, many ways. It's not unique to me to claim that. That's pretty darn obvious. So even if you're not consciously listening to experts for their opinions to go by and say, well, this probably was the Russians carrying out a false flag operations. They want to have an excuse to start World War III. And again, go back to that but that I brought up just a moment ago. Well, how would that make any sense? Because if we really were afraid of them starting World War III, because that's a real aim, to start World War III, wouldn't we try to negotiate something to prevent World War III instead of what we've been recently engaged in, which has been what? Expanding all of the nations on the globe that can possibly militarize, surrounding them. Because remember what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union. We traipsed in there, again, the West, and said, we're going to buy everything a dime on a dollar, kind of like the carpetbaggers after the Civil War, who I'm sure if Lincoln had survived, he would not have tolerated this kind of nonsense. Him and his retinue, whoever, his leadership would not have tolerated it. Nevertheless, why would the West have acted in that fashion? Well, you can say, well, there really is no quote unquote West. It's all just happenstance. Things just happen. That's another way, a mentality. I'm just a victim. I don't have to really cognize current world crisis in terms of trying to find a solution, because in the end, we're all victims to history. That's another way. And that's essentially a kind of a dropout. Don't worry, be happy, in the words of the recent pop song. That's a third avenue. Another one, and the most important one, is to, if we, and this is the core of what I want to get to, examine our assumptions. Because if you look at my blog, that is indeed what it's all about. Don't enter into this blog, into this reading, without examining or being open to examining your assumptions. Because, as a matter of fact, the key to placing yourself in the cockpit, if you will, of history is, first of all, examining assumptions. And this goes back to the method throughout human society that we know, and of course we can posit that even the ones that we don't know, examining the assumptions of society is what moves us as a species ahead, allows progress, which I've written many. If you go and you put in Plato or Socrates into your browser under my in my blog, you'll see many references to this idea. That, in particular, if you look at the trial of Socrates, what was he accused of? What was he doing? Was it he was accused of the youth, corrupting the youth of Athens through his questions about the issues of truth or falsehood. Because that's what he did. He simply questioned the assumptions of society at that time about truth or falsehood. So that, I contend, spurred history and created a singularity in history. And you can see in my writings how I bring that into the manifold of scientific progress. What I mean by that is this. You can look at all of physical reality, biophysical reality. You know, in the first part, physical reality would, of course, encompass biophysical reality, but I want to see it as a separation in the way that Vernadsky did. The inorganic physical reality, the biophysical reality, and then, most importantly, the human mental reality, or the noetic realm. Because you have to separate human creative thinking from all other conscious mammal or animal, or even plant life for that matter, because plant life, you can consider it conscious as well. As Fechner did in his novel Emma, which we are finding more and more out about today, by the way. But anyway, to get back to the idea that how Plato, as a singularity, coheres with especially the breakthroughs in geometric analysis of Bernard Riemann. Riemann's paper of shock wave propagation, because that's what it was, forecast, if you will, a way in which technology via a mental experiment, what Einstein called Gedanken experiment, could in the future be picked up and revolutionize humanity's technology. That's very similar to what Plato did and Socrates did. Plato through his telling of what Socrates did. In other words, in terms of dynamics, let's say electrodynamic, fluid dynamics, the dynamics of the carrying of sound as pressure waves is what Riemann's paper was about. In terms of dynamics, in the realm of human creative thinking, human history, as a practice of creative thinking, what Socrates and Plato did was create a singular point by saying, look, what we have operating right now in our society is an oligarchy whose view of perfection, i.e. the gods that rule, or the ruling mentality, the ruling principle, the principles that rule our thinking itself. That oligarchy says that gods can be just as downright wantonly mere beasts themselves, talking beasts, as Aristotle, the opponent of Plato, himself said. The definition of humans, they're talking beasts. So that couldn't be tolerated because, along with the other great works like the principle of the cave, of the shadows on the wall, which were being held to view only the shadows of reality and not the reality, while the manipulators behind us. Who are the manipulators? The same ones that created these false gods. False, because why are they false? Because if they're perfection, if they're truly gods and they are above us, our betters, our overlords, then they can't have this imperfection within them, can they? Is that logical? From the standpoint of a higher sense of logic, from the standpoint of Leibniz's monadology, for example, in terms of the overarching principle of logic. So that's the other way in which to perceive. To conceive perhaps, can I, as an individual human being, put my ideas out there and somehow rescue humanity from the precipice of which it's currently on at this moment in any efficient manner? I think of Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley's words about how great poetry can sort of waft its ideas upon the timeline of human history from an elevated standpoint, that we will ourselves, by the very nature of what are the best angels, if you will, of our own humanity, respond to. Because we're forced to respond to it. We can, as I said, as I went through earlier, we can have these different things of avoidance, these different mind frames of avoidance or explanations to ourselves, etc. But we will respond to truth. Truth. Because what the truth, and this is extremely important point, is beauty. In other words, beauty fascinates ourselves as human beings. It is alluring. It allures us into a different frame of mind. We had these conflicts based on ideologies in this last century that I grew up in. For example, Marxian ideology said that there is class warfare, class struggle, that's what really is human history is about. That's what he had determined, or his co-thinkers, and so forth, class struggle. Today, I want to, how you said he wanted to turn Hegel on his head? We need to turn Marx on his head. Now, that's already kind of been done already in the past, but just to say it anew, what we have today, in fact, is a warfare class. Not class warfare, but a warfare class. For humanity to rise above the assumptions of geopolitics, of the warfare class, how do we achieve that? We had started upon that road in the past in the United States to cooperate and rise above, especially in terms of my early youth. John Kennedy, who I actually was on my father's shoulders and saw him riding down the boulevard in Niagara Falls, New York, where he rode with an open card before he was assassinated. You could see his bright, I guess, auburn hair. I still sort of remember that because I was only maybe 10 years old or so. But if you look at that era, we had approached this, said, okay, what are we going to do for humanity that may bring us together out of the current peril of the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth and so on? What will we be able to do? Well, again, going back to my blog, you will see that the development of nuclear fusion as an engine for the not only energy but system of propulsion for colonizing space or occupying space, whatever you want to call it. I know colonizing these days is one of those words that's kind of forbidden. But anyhow, that was something that kind of had a potential to get us out of the current miasma that I began this video with this morning, of the current world crisis confrontation leading to all-out nuclear war and how we react to it. So that pretty much I guess this will be my first adventure into blogging. If I can cast it, I'll think of some kind of label and what have you. I'm really not into creating an audience via various kinds of manipulations and tricks. I hope that you have gotten something out of this. Of course, I'll be glad to dialogue with you. Any comments you want to leave and what have you, or hopefully will be available on as I put this video on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.